Hey there, today we're going to take an in-depth look into pressure canning. If you're interested in learning more beyond what we cover today, feel free to take a look at the National Center for Home Food Preservation website. I'll link that down in the description below. Let's first get started by taking a look at the equipment that we'll be using today, and then we'll begin filling our jars. Today we're going to be using a pressure canner. This pressure canner came with a lid that has a built-in gauge, and we'll also be using this weight along with a rack that goes down in the bottom of the pot to help protect the jars. We also have a ladle, a funnel, a bowl that we'll be putting some hot boiling water in after we've washed our lids with hot soapy water. Then we'll place the lids in here and just let them soak while we're preparing the jars. We also have a lid lifter to get the lids out of the hot water. We have a measuring tool to measure the headspace before we fill the jars. We have a jar lifter to get the jars out of the pot when they're very hot. We also have the bands that will go on top of the lids. We have a permanent marker to write on the lid so we know what it is that we canned and the date that we did that. We have a towel that we're going to place the jars on. So after we take them out of the hot pot, we'll put them on this towel to help protect them from the cold countertop and keep them from cracking. We have our jars. We have some distilled white vinegar and a paper towel, which will be used to wipe the top of the jars to make sure that we remove any food that may be sitting on there or any debris that could keep those lids from sealing. As far as our jars, if you are pressure canning or if you're water bath canning and it is going to exceed 10 minutes of time that the jars will be in the boiling water, you do not need to sterilize your jars. It's not required. I throw mine in the dishwasher, run them through the dishwasher, and happen to have a tool or an option on the dishwasher that does sterilize the jars, so I just use that to be safe. But generally, if you are going to be water bath canning and it will be less than 10 minutes, you do want to soak these jars in boiling water for 10 minutes. Before we start filling our jars, we do need to add some water to our pot, about 2 to 3 inches down in the bottom, along with about 3 tablespoons of distilled white vinegar to help avoid getting that cloudy residue on the exterior of the jars. We'll also put in our rack to protect the jars and get the heat started so that this can begin heating up while we're filling our jars. We've started the stove and the water is beginning to heat up. So let's go ahead and fill our bowl with the boiling water, and then we'll drop in our clean lids that have been washed in hot soapy water. The next step is to fill our jars with the food. Today we made chili, so it's going to be quick and easy. We'll just place the funnel on top. Then we'll use the ladle to pour the chili in, and as we're pouring it in, we also want to be checking the headspace. We'll be using this headspace tool, placing it on the edge of the jar and checking to make sure that we have the correct measurements. And with the headspace, basically from the lowest point of this tool to this furthest corner over here, that is exactly 1 inch, and this recipe happens to call for 1 inch, so that's what we'll be measuring. And we want to make sure that we do have enough headspace, because as this is pressure canning in the pot, the food is going to expand slightly and it could actually heat and expand outside of the jar. And so we need that extra space to make sure that that doesn't happen. And then of course, we don't want to have too little amount of food in the jars as well. Let's start filling our jars. We had just enough chili to fill 6 of the jars, which means we need to fill 1 of these jars with water because this canner does hold 7 quarts and we don't want to have any empty space inside of the canner. After we've filled these jars, Again, we want to check the headspace, so I'm just setting this in and checking to make sure that we have that 1 inch of headspace on each of these. We can go ahead and remove our funnel. Headspace looks good. While you're checking the headspace with the measurement tool, you also want to push the tool down into the sides of the jar just to make sure that you release any of the air bubbles. Now we can go ahead and clean the top of the jars using the distilled white vinegar and our paper towel, just to make sure we remove any food that may be setting there. And something else to mention is that before you even wash these jars in the dishwasher or through the boiling water, you want to do a quick check along the top of the jars and inspect them to make sure there aren't any chips or cracks. Same thing with the sides of the jars. If you see anything like that, be sure to throw them away. Don't try to can in a jar that's been chipped or cracked, because it could crack even further in the pressure canner or the water bath canner. And then also, even if there's just a very small chip in this top of the jar, what could happen is that that lid that you put on there may not seal, and you could get into a situation where you are looking at botulism or spoiled food. So definitely throw your jars away if you find any chips or cracks. After we've cleaned the jars, the top of the jars here, we can go ahead and apply the lids and then the bands. Next, we can place the lids on the jars, and I'm going to use the lid lifter to make sure I don't burn my fingers as I'm getting the lids out of the hot water. Just checking to make sure those lids are centered on top of the jars, and now I'm going to put the bands on. As I'm putting the bands on, I just want to make sure that they're finger tight. I'm not going to crank really hard on those jars, and I also don't want to keep the bands loose. So again, just finger tight when you're putting the bands on the jars. These are ready to go in the canner. I'll go ahead and place them in there along with this jar that's going to be full of water, along with the lid and the band. And then we'll talk a little bit about the lid that goes on the pressure canner, because we have a little bit of prep work to do with that as well. Depending on what kind of a pressure cooker you have, you may have a lid that seals with a rubber gasket. Or in this case, this one is metal. So the metal lid sets on the metal pot, and it's just a metal to metal seal. And in order for it to seal properly for the pressure cooking, we do have to add some oil to the pot. And I'll show you, it's just going to be a small amount of olive oil that I'll put onto a paper towel, and then I will just wipe it around the pot in the area where the seal is, to make sure that when I put the lid on, we have that olive oil between the pot and the lid. Taking a closer look at the pot, you can see this dark rim right here. That's where we need to get the olive oil. And again, I'm just going to use a paper towel. I'll put some olive oil on there, and then I'll just rub it into the seal there. You can also use your finger, just make sure that the pot is not hot so you're not burning yourself. It's something that you can do before you even turn the heat on. Next, we'll place the lid on the pot, and this lid has an arrow that points to a little divot here where I need to make sure that those line up. So I'll line those up. Just jiggle the lid a little bit to make sure that it's in place. Next, we can go ahead and start tightening down the wing nuts on the opposite sides. We wouldn't want to do one at a time, because that could end up in a situation where it's slightly lopsided. We also checked to make sure that it's completely flush. We don't want the lid to be lopsided before we start tightening these nuts down. So again, I'm just going to start on the opposite sides and just get them slightly snug just so they're in place. And then I'll continue working around. If you get into a situation like this where it's too tight, you can go ahead and just loosen that up the opposite direction and then start tightening. Those are slightly snug. Go ahead and get the last couple on here. And then we'll go around and start tightening these on opposite sides. After we've tightened all of the wing nuts down, we're going to watch this spout here. As soon as steam starts coming out, we're going to set a timer for 10 minutes and allow the steam to continuously escape for that 10 minutes before we place the weight on. This has been steaming consistently for 10 minutes, so we'll go ahead and place the weight on. And because of our altitude, we're just going to set our weight at 10 pounds. So the number 10 will be facing down, and we'll just place it right on the spout. After you've placed the weight on the spout, you're going to listen for a jiggle. And after that first jiggle, you're going to set your timer based on the processing time listed on the recipe. For this particular recipe, it's 90 minutes. We are using the quart-sized jars, so we'll go ahead and set our timer for 90 minutes. And during that 90 minutes, we're going to continue listening for the jiggle, and we want to make sure that with this particular canner, yours may be different, but with this one, we want to hear it jiggle 2 to 3 times per minute. Timer is set for 90 minutes. We will be back soon. The timer is up, so we can go ahead and turn the stove off. We did adjust the heat throughout the processing time. We started out medium-high, and then we eventually reduced it down to medium-low as we were monitoring this weight, and we could see that it was jiggling more than 2 to 3 times per minute. After we reduced the heat, it was jiggling perfectly. With the gauge, we're currently at 10 pounds, and we want to wait until this drops down to 0 pounds before we remove the weight. If we remove the weight before it reduces down to 0 pounds, it could compromise the jars. It can cause the food to escape out of the jars and possibly even cause the jars to explode. So let's go ahead and keep the weight on there until we're down to 0 pounds, and then we'll remove it and can proceed from there. It has been about 30 minutes since we turned the heat off on the stove, and the gauge has dropped down to 0 pounds, which indicates it is now safe to remove the weight. We'll go ahead and use a hot pad because it is still pretty hot. We don't want to burn ourselves, but we'll remove that weight, release the wing nuts, and lift the lid away from our face to allow any steam that's trapped in there to escape without burning us. And from there, we'll go ahead and use this guy to take the jars out of the pot. We'll place them on the towel that we have laid out here. And from there, they just need to cool for the next 12 to 24 hours. Then we can label them with the permanent marker. We'll put today's date on it, what it is that we canned. And the last thing to do is to remove the bands. Removing the bands is somewhat controversial. Some people prefer to leave them on. I personally remove the bands. That way, if something spoils, it builds up gas and releases out of the jar, assuming that something didn't seal properly. That would be my trigger to know that something went bad. Whereas if you have the bands on there, it's going to hold that lid down and you may not know that something has spoiled in there. So again, personal preference, do what makes the most sense for you. But let's go ahead and get these jars out of the canner and we'll take a look at what we have. These jars have been resting for about 12 hours. We wiped down the exterior. We labeled the top with a permanent marker. We have the name of the item that we've canned. We have the date. You can also see that the lid is depressed. If I push on it, it doesn't make that popping noise. When the lid is depressed like this, that means that it has sealed. We've also removed all of the bands, and these are ready for storage. We're going to store them in a dark, cool place for up to 1 year. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments and we'll be sure to respond. We'll continue building out this series and we will see you again soon.